All right, another major story we're following this morning. There are significant developments in Ukraine's efforts to hit back against Russian aggression. Ukraine launched a massive drone attack deep inside Russian territory. The New York Times calls it a coordinated operation that targeted sites from eastern Siberia to Russia's western border. A source inside Ukraine's security service tells NBC News that more than 40 Russian bomber planes were targeted in the operation nearly 3,000 miles away from Ukraine. The mission, codenamed Spiderweb, is estimated to have cost Russia more than $2 billion worth of damage to its planes. The attack was planned over the past year and a half and involved a meticulous method of first smuggling the drones into Russia and then disguising them so they could be activated remotely. NBC News cannot independently verify the claims made by the Ukrainian source. However, Russia's defense ministry confirmed the attacks in a statement. There's also video. Let's bring in NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons and editor at The Insider, Michael Weiss. Good to have you both with us.
We'll be with you all in just 1 minute. David Ignatius, I want to begin with you, though. It is hard, is it not, to overstate the scale, the scope, the significance of these attacks. That's why we have the best panel of experts possible. I want to begin with you, David. Explain the scale and the scope of this and the strategic significance of it. And yes, the audacity of it. It's every part of this operation seems breathtaking. Tell us about it.
So, Joe, Operation Spiderweb does show that Ukraine still has the ability to attack Russia in creative, surprising, aggressive ways across the whole breadth of that vast country. The basic details that we've learned, that this was planned for 18 months, that the Ukrainians figured out a way to take these cheap little FPV drones, as they're called, and pack them and transport them to near the attack sites in ways that were invisible to the Russians, and then use them to attack some of the most strategic aircraft in the Russian fleet in these widely dispersed bases from Siberia all the way to Murmansk in the north. It's a statement, Joe and Mika, that contrary to what President Trump said just a few weeks ago, Ukraine does have cards. You remember Trump saying, you have no cards. Basically, you have to capitulate in these negotiations. And here's Ukraine on the day before negotiations are set to begin in Istanbul saying, oh, yes, we do have cards. Take a look. It's said that there are 47 Russian planes that were in some way damaged. 117 Ukrainian drones are said to have been used in the attack. It's a startling statement. We're not as weak as you think we are.
Yeah, Keir Simmons, I'm curious Russia's reaction to this and what you're hearing about the scale of these attacks.
Well, Russia's calling it a terrorist attack. Says the actions were, quote, repelled, and that it has detained some involved, although Ukraine says its operatives escaped Russia without capture. I think that's probably a holding pattern by the Russians. When inside Moscow, our folks who are based there say that on the morning news in Moscow, there was very little reporting, if none, of this, because the Russians will be kind of, licking their wounds, frankly, as David suggests. I mean, to give you another picture of the statistics, according to the Ukrainians, 34% of Russia's cruise missile-capable aircraft have been taken out by this attack. And just the audacity of it, it's very difficult to describe to folks who haven't been to Russia how big Russia is. 11 time zones. You get that picture when you're over in Siberia or over in Vladivostok, and you do a live shot for evening news shows on the East Coast, and it's the morning. in Russia. I mean, it is enormous. It's a long, long way from Ukraine. And for Ukraine to have been capable of doing this, been capable over all of those months of hiding those drones in those cargo trucks, and then to release images of those trucks, the roof, opening remotely, of those Russian bombers burning on the tarmac, unprotected is another point. The Russians were so confident that these long-range bombers were not able to be struck that they were not in hangars protected. They were frankly unprotected. I mean, to David's point about cards, there's a meme going around, and of course there's so much propaganda that follows these kinds of things. There's a meme going around that is a king of drones playing card. It is like something from a spy thriller, the actual operation.
It really is.
Of course, there now will be questions about how President Putin will respond. We haven't heard from him yet. He has his delegation in Istanbul right now, in Turkey, negotiating with the Ukrainians. One of the questions has been, the Ukrainians, according to an envoy like Keith Kellogg, President Trump's envoy, have put forward their term sheet for what they want, their negotiating position. The Russians haven't done that. The Trump administration is saying, OK, President Putin, you've got weeks before we get fed up with this. Give us your term sheet. The question is whether a strike like this puts pressure on President Putin to negotiate more, or angers him and leads to further strikes. Just this weekend, I should just say, and I point out, it's important to say, there were further strikes in Ukraine, 71-year-old woman killed. So despite the talk by the Trump administration of a ceasefire, frankly, there is no sign on the ground, in real terms, of a ceasefire on either side.
And it certainly doesn't escape notice of most observers here that Vladimir Putin often targets civilians in the terror campaign, kills elderly people in apartment complexes, children on playgrounds. The Ukrainians, of course, attacking military sites over this weekend. Michael Weiss, let me bring you in here. The asymmetry of all of this is also breathtaking. We've talked about the scale and the scope of it, the strategic importance, but Michael, let's talk about the asymmetry of it. Is Michael here? Can we get Michael up? Thank you. The asymmetry of all of this, Michael, where drones can be used, launched from 18-wheelers, and blowing up these planes instead of aircraft carriers.
I mean, what we don't appreciate, I think, in the West is there's been a complete revolution in 21st century warfare pioneered by the Ukrainians. I mean, drones are their wonder weapon, of this campaign. And they'll tell you, we talk about U.S. security assistance, which is deeply important. They need three things. They need air defense systems, which can shoot down ballistic missiles, rocket artillery, such as ATACMS and GIMLRS for their HIMARS, howitzer ammunition. But they will also emphasize, look, now this war is much different from what it was in 2022. 40% of what Ukraine relies on for its defense capability is domestically sourced, including and especially these FPV drones, which now run on fiber optic cables. An entire fleet of pilots are trained to do nothing but fly these things. And you have to appreciate, Joe, this is a military intelligence operation planned 18 months, completely undetected by Russia, which is one of the most invigilated countries on the planet. The FSB, the successor to the KGB, they control the border. The Ukrainians managed to recruit assets inside Russia, smuggle these things into concealed compartments in shipping containers, then have lorries drive those shipping containers within striking distance of multiple, at least 4, possibly 5 different airfields. And they've possibly taken out now a third of Russia's strategic bombers. One of the things Ukraine will tell you is they run low on air defense systems. The Trump administration is apparently looking to find new Patriot missile batteries for them to put around major cities, population centers. You mentioned that the Russians are very fond of attacking civilians. This is a huge problem for them. So what they do is what's known as targeting the Archer rather than the arrows. These planes are the ones that shoot cruise missiles at Ukrainian women and children and destroy apartment blocks on a daily basis. So this is a massive, massive coup for Ukraine. And I just want to emphasize, If you go back now and rewatch that footage of Volodymyr Zelensky sitting in the Oval Office having his 2 minutes of hate session by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who were telling him, you have no agency, without the United States, you're finished, you're done, you have no cards. In the back of the Ukrainian president's mind was, oh yeah, wait till you see what's up my sleeve next.
Let's bring in right now former U.S. Ambassador to both Sweden and Poland, Mark Brzezinski. Mr. Ambassador, Mark, we want to get you in on this conversation because it's very interesting. I've made a couple of trips to Europe over the past 6 months, and we've talked about a lot of things about where the United States is going, but also where this war is going. And I was fascinated whenever the conversations turned to military. Suddenly, in whispered tones, people around the table that knew about this war and knew about weapons started talking about drone warfare. And they were saying it's going to be a type of drone warfare that is going to forever change battlefields. And at the time, of course, the Houthis were shooting drones at ships and we were talking about the asymmetry of that. But I was told 2-3 months ago, just wait and see what's being developed that's going to be used against the Russians. You obviously served on the front lines as an ambassador there in Poland. Talk about what happened over the weekend and how this may be the future of this war.
And I'm speaking to you from Warsaw, Poland this morning, Joe and Mika. Thank you for having me. This is an important development in the sense that these are attacks well within Russia. And remember, during the Biden administration, there was a lot of pressure put on the Ukrainians to keep the battle within the battlefields of Ukraine. And now we're talking about airfields deep into Russia, which shows, one, the innovative capacity of the Ukrainians fighting for their lives is practically limitless in terms of what they pulled off, but also, two, that the battlefield is changing. And remember, when President Putin first became president, replacing Boris Yeltsin in 2000, the Chechen War with Russia was going on. And at first, the Chechen War was contained within the borders of Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia in the North Caucasus. And then the Chechens began to hit inside Russia, including in Moscow, but also in territories well within Russia. And Putin very quickly changed his tactics to scorched earth with regard to Chechnya. So we'll see what happens in terms of the retaliation from the Russian side today. You know, everyone wants these efforts towards peace to be successful, for there ultimately to be a fair peace, a ceasefire, and a rebuilding of Ukraine. My worry is that we're going to see this drag on for a long time. We're approaching 1 million casualties on the Russian side. I repeat, 1 million casualties. When the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan in the 1980s, it was after 40,000 casualties. Today, we're talking 1 million casualties on the Russian side, and Putin shows no sign of wanting to truly address peace.
Now, this is the kind of advice most of us get at one point or another in our lives. It goes like this: when you find yourself in a hole, just stop digging. Well, today, despite pleading from a majority of the American people on the topic of our very economy, the Trump administration isn't just refusing to put down the shovel, it is calling in an excavator and preparing to dig ever deeper. It starts with a round of new tariffs, or rather expanded ones. Since we last met, Donald Trump announced he is doubling the current tariff rate on steel and aluminum imports up to 50%. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked about that this weekend. He did his best to paint a rosy picture.
But do you have a prediction on how much it's going to impact the construction industry, for example?
Well, I have a prediction on how much it's going to impact the steel industry, and we'll see. There are a lot of elasticities that this is a very complicated ecosystem. So, is it going to impact the construction industry? Maybe, but it's going to impact the steel industry in a great way. Yeah. There's going to be capital investment, and the number of jobs is going to be grown around the country, whether it's in Pittsburgh, whether it's in Arkansas, whether it's in Alabama.
Don't worry, there are elasticities. It sounds like a scrunchie. Of course, after not one, but two defeats in federal court last week, there's an open question as to whether or not Trump even has the authority to do this, to impose some of his steepest tariffs at all. Those rulings against Trump are currently on pause as the Trump administration prepares to appeal. But despite such an existential threat, such an open question around the cornerstone of Donald Trump's trade war, the response from members of his economic team so far has been essentially, who cares, not us.
We're going to take that up to higher courts. The president's going to win like he always does. But rest assured, tariffs are not going away. He has so many other authorities.
We've studied every possible way that President Trump's tariff agenda could be pursued. And so we're very thrilled. We're very confident that the judges would uphold this law. And so I think that that's plan A. And we're very, very confident that plan A is all we're ever going to need.
But we called it A because we needed a name different from B, in case we're wrong. So said there out loud, plan A suggests there are backup plans, maybe named B or C, that Trump is preparing to roll out if, for example, the courts rule against his use of what they're calling, quote, international economic emergencies. It's the rationale for levying these deeply unpopular tariffs at all. This reporting in the New York Times explains, quote, the steel and aluminum tariffs were issued under a legal statute related to national security. It's known as Section 232. To impose those types of tariffs, the president must first initiate an investigation into whether imports of a certain item poses a national security threat. If that investigation determines that they pose a threat, the president has the authority to tax those imports. Trump has already used that authority to order tariffs on foreign cars and car parts. His administration is carrying out investigations into many other areas, including pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, copper, airplanes, trucks, and critical minerals. Those investigations could be used to roll out more tariffs soon, regardless of the outcome of the court cases. Digging ever deeper, deeper, and deeper is where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Anchor and correspondent for Bloomberg News, David Gura, is here. Also joining us is Justin Wolfers, professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. First, David Gura, your reaction to, I don't even know what we're at, quadrupling down?
So these were rolled out by the president, if you can call it that, at this rally that he held in Pittsburgh on Friday. And the backdrop to that was this announcement of a deal that he'd brokered, he says, with Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel. I should say, first of all, we have no detail on what that consists of. And he threw out a lot of red meat at that rally. And that's what it was, essentially, was a rally to the workers who were gathered there about the promise of spending billions on renovating factories and the jobs that would come back. But there's very little meat on the bone. There's no written document, no deal that we've seen between Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel. So here we have him now expanding these tariffs on steel and aluminum. He put out that quota over the course of the weekend in a social media post to 50%. And this is going to have widespread effects, yes, on the steel industry, to pick up on what Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said, but on all manner of things. And so we think of what Margaret Brennan so shrewdly brought up there in her questioning, the effect this is going to have on construction, for instance. But we use so much steel and aluminum in our daily lives for all manner of things. So yes, it's cars and tractors and buildings. It's also the sodas that you buy at the store. It's the canned food that you might get, the fruit, the vegetables. All of this is going to trickle down. So it presents this kind of very bizarre moment where the president and his team continue to talk about the importance of bringing prices down of everyday goods. And all the while, by raising tariffs in the way in which he proposes, it's going to be a trickle-down economics of a different kind. It's going to make goods like that more expensive.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So they promised 90 deals in 90 days. There are no deals. There's a framework with the UK, and there were some on-again, off-again talks in Switzerland with China. There's also no deal with Nippon Steel.
We've heard that they've come to some kind of agreement, but there really is no written document, nothing that we've seen. And so if you remember the history of this, and of course, central to this is this really stark reversal. This is a deal that President Trump was against on the campaign trail. He didn't think that a Japanese company should own an American steel company like U.S. Steel. He's reversed that. All the while, this went through a CFIUS review. This was reviewed by the government on national security grounds.
Right.
That would have to happen again now if there is this deal that he's talking about.
Let me just ask you one more question. So it was viewed as in our national security interest, okay with our national security to have Nippon Steel, to have that deal go through. How are they then turning to a national security argument to levy all their new tariffs?
They're using what they call a golden share, which is how he and Secretary Lutnick and Secretary Bessent have talked about it, that the U.S. will exert large influence on the way that this company is going to work within the United States. They'll have control over personnel and the way that the company is directed. They're making the case that it's a deal, it's a merger in effect of these two companies, and the U.S. will play a role in sort of how it operates going forward here.
It sounds like socialism.
In a way, yeah.
In a way. So we have socialism in a way. We have no deal with Nippon Steel that we can review or look at. Justin, what is happening?
Wow. Okay. So, as I understand it, the president turned up to a steel rally on Friday, and in the back room, this is his description, said, "How about a 40% tariff on steel?" And they said, "Oh, that's good." And he said, "Would you prefer 50?" And they said, "Yes." So that's how we're at 50% tariff on steels. By the way, on steel. And then the next day, the White House clarified when they said steel, they also meant aluminum. And if this sounds like a policy process, it's not. And then the other thing I want you to realize is in the background, the White House claims to be negotiating with 90 countries. Forget the 200 sub-deals it's already done. But if you and I are negotiating about international trade, and in the middle of that negotiation, days before apparently we're going to announce something, you all of a sudden start putting new tariffs on goods that my country produces, I'm going to feel pretty cranky about that. And this sort of behaviour just absolutely scuttles any possibility of there being any serious deal from anyone.
So what happens now?
Well, the first thing is actually the country that the president is clobbering the hardest is the United States. The steel industry, you should understand, is a very, very small part of our economy. It employs about 100,000 people in an economy of 160 million workers. I care about those people. My heart goes out to them. But I also want to remember the other 159,900,000, because steel is a small part of our economy, but it's a big part of the inputs through the rest of manufacturing. So if you wanted to find a way to really destroy American manufacturing, what you do is figure out a way to jack up the cost of steel for American manufacturers. And that's what the president's just done. In fact, he's done this once before. In 2018, he put tariffs on steel. And studies of that episode suggest that he did actually succeed in saving around 1,000 American jobs, which sounds terrific until you realise that the more expensive steel that rippled out through the rest of the manufacturing industry, which is much, much larger, cost another 75,000 jobs. So the president ended up destroying 75 times more jobs than he saved last time he tried the exact same trick.
We've talked a lot. Actually, you guys have given me an education in sort of the foundations of our economy. And so much of its resilience and strength is the American consumer. Here's where they are today. This is NBC's reporting. A recent consumer pulse report from the accounting firm KPMG surveyed 1,516 U.S. consumers and found that, quote, in response to tariffs, 50% of them are cutting back on purchases, 49% of them are actively seeking deals and discounts. When asked specifically about summer plans, many said they are still choosing to travel, but have otherwise cracked down on personal expenses. Quote, we're seeing a more selective and cost-conscious summer travel season. That's according to KPMG. Quote, vacations are still in the budget, but nearly everything else is on the chopping block.
I'll defer to the academic economist on the latest data, but I'll say that this issue of sentiment is something that we've been tracking a lot since the beginning of this term. Consumers are worried about what's happening. They can't understand why it's happening. That's true.
Can we stop there? Please. I mean, what is happening?
We've seen from company after company them say that this is going to raise the cost of the inputs that Justin was talking about, of products that we import from overseas. They're sounding the alarm that this is going to have real-world effects on the things that we buy.
Walmart told us that they're going to raise their prices.
Walmart said it, right. Target and others. And look, many of them will try to shoulder that for as long as they can, but they can't do it in perpetuity. And we can talk about sort of the nature of this being an emergency. But as it stands, this is something that we anticipate is going to go on ad infinitum until a court stops it or lawmakers stop it or the president gives up. So this is something they're going to have to live with. And it's going to have significant real-world effects on people who are buying things, companies who are hiring, companies who are deciding whether or not they're going to build another factory or not, or expand. So that's kind of where we're at. And so that's where the sentiment kind of meets the harder data. And you hear the administration kind of trumpeting the success they've had with import data, for instance. It's not as bad as everyone feared that it might be. It's still backward looking, and we still haven't reached the point, and again, I'll defer to Justin on this, where the hard data hasn't married with the sentiment data. But what the sentiment data is telling us is that people are very freaked out about what's happening and likely to happen here.
So you've probably all seen the photos of President Trump's top campaign donor, Elon Musk, in the Oval Office on Friday with a big old shiner with his black eye. He claimed to have gotten that by being punched by his 5-year-old son. Okay, maybe. But with this Oval Office appearance ostensibly being his farewell after several months in Washington gutting the American government, everybody sort of had the same idea at the same time, right? The metaphors practically wrote themselves. You know, Musk has literal black eye and figurative black eye as he leaves. What? May I suggest an even better metaphor for what Elon Musk did in these last few months in Washington? Starting in March, we pretty closely covered the story of one little agency, an independent nonprofit called the U.S. Institute of Peace. Elon Musk's operatives at Doge literally forced their way into the Institute of Peace in an operation that reportedly involved the FBI, the D.C. Metropolitan Police, the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, and a private security firm. Musk and Doge literally used armed force to get into the headquarters of this little institute. They then used that armed force to physically throw out the staff. They then purported to fire all the staff, even though they legally don't have the power to do that. The thing that has always made this story sort of weirder and wilder than you might expect is that this U.S. Institute of Peace, it doesn't belong to the executive branch. It's an independent nonprofit. It was created by Congress over 40 years ago. It's largely funded by its own private endowment. The Institute owns its own building, its headquarters. They control the land the building sits on. And yet, Trump and his top campaign donor, Elon Musk, used force to not only take the building, but to also take the Institute's money, its endowment, which, again, was not the government's to take. Once Elon Musk's people had forced their way into the building and forced out the employees, one Institute of Peace official told us, quote, "They were very thorough in how they decimated us. They wiped our IT system, canceled contracts, shredded documents, took down our website, including all of our 40 years of research and work we had done. They seized not only our building, but also all of our funding, including our endowment funds." Well, now, perhaps predictably, a federal judge has ruled that all of that, from the armed takeover of the building to the firing of the employees to the seizing all the Institute's assets, all of that was quite flagrantly illegal. The judge called it a gross usurpation of power and a way of conducting government affairs that unnecessarily traumatized the committed leadership and employees of the U.S. Institute of Peace, who deserved better. The judge ordered the Trump administration to give everything back. And so Musk and all his minions have been forced to give it all back. And when the reinstated actual leaders of the U.S. Institute of Peace returned to their building for the first time in over 2 months, just a few days ago, what they found was water damage and rats and roaches, things they had never had before. The acting director of the Institute of Peace told Judge Howell in a sworn statement that the Trump administration essentially abandoned the building as soon as they stole it, and that, quote, failure to maintain and secure the building resulted, among other things, in the rats and roaches. And apparently, whole juicy buds. The Economist reports tonight that cleaners also found a whole bunch of marijuana that was apparently left behind by Doge staffers after they left the place. So, maximum destruction, leaving everything soiled and in disrepair and littered with drugs. And now, because all of that was totally illegal, the folks at the U.S. Institute of Peace will have to, repair everything and stand everything back up in order to even start to get back to where they were before this whole thing started. It's just pure pointlessness and waste. And may I suggest that, yes, the black eye was cute, but may I suggest that this is perhaps more on the nose as the legacy of what the Trump administration has done through Trump's top campaign donor, Elon Musk, as Elon Musk leaves Washington. A building seized pointlessly, shut down pointlessly, left to be infested by vermin. Also, its rightful owners can eventually come back and have to put it all back together again for no reason at all. I think that's a better metaphor. I'm just going to say it.
I think sometimes when we talk about this budget, we talk about it in silos as though it's only going to affect people who are on Medicaid or it's only going to affect people who benefit from some government services. You always look at the economy as this macro question. How do you think this bill, as written now, understanding it has to go through the Senate, impacts the economy as a whole?
Well, you know, people forget that a lot of what people are paying for their monthly budget is their mortgage. It's their credit card. Interest rates are still looking to go up because of the huge amount of debt that they are taking on to finance these tax cuts. All the healthcare losses are going to mean more of those medical bills that people have to battle on. And of course, if groceries and other key essentials are more expensive, we will pay for this in one way or another.
At the core of it, though, for a lot of those folks, in addition to the things you touch on, are some of the fundamentals. All right. So it's the food I put on the table, but it's the health care I got to pay for because I got a sick grandmama. I got a husband who's not doing well. I've got my own issues, my kids. You've got the Washington Post reporting Republicans trying to repeal Obamacare again. And look, for the record, everybody know I was part of that fight.
Yeah, no, but it's okay. Go ahead. You know what? We'll take you.
No. Look, I admit the loss then, right? We fought and we lost. The American people said they didn't want it. The Congress was able to do what they wanted to do, right? And that was 2010. Since that time, though, you have now congressional Republicans pursuing changes to the Affordable Care Act that would mean 10.7 million fewer Americans using its insurance marketplaces and Medicaid, a huge reduction that some view as a way to accomplish part of the health care coverage cancellation that failed in 2017. So even between that 2010 period and 2017, you can make the case, repeal Obamacare. But as I said in close quarters then, and continue throughout to say, what are you replacing it with? We still need to have a plan. Republicans have never offered a plan, nothing even close to viable as a plan. Repeal and replace is not a plan. It's not a strategy. It doesn't even, it's good rhetoric and that's about it. So for a lot of Americans, that's when it gets real for them. When all of a sudden they've got these doctor bills and these healthcare expenses that hit them, but then pre-existing conditions come back. A lot of this narrative comes back for a lot of families. How does that feed this unease that people have about what Republicans are doing?
Well, there's a real tension because on one hand, they're also saying people should have more children. People should have more families.
But they don't want to pay for the health care.
But if you're going to have no health care, if the cost of student loans in higher education is going to be jacked up, if it's more costly to get food, how on earth are you supposed to have more and more children to support when housing costs are still so burdensome and nothing has been done to address it? So to me, this is the canary in the coal mine for actually undermining how it would cost for a family to survive.
I think it's so important you keep talking about housing and these other costs that people find in that affects people in their everyday lives, because when folks talk about affordability, that is what they mean. The ability that they can afford to live how they would like to live every day. And that is grocery prices, yes. That is housing, whether it's rent or your mortgage. And I was looking at today, there are retailers who are raising their prices as Donald Trump's tariffs take hold. It's from CNBC. Multiple major retailers said they have already raised some prices or plan to hike them in the coming weeks to offset the duties. They include major grocers and consumer goods sellers like Costco, Best Buy, Walmart, and Target. I shop at Costco. Okay, I knew the prices was going up because I went into Costco the other day and I said, now, what is going on? I still bought it. But if I'm noticing the numbers, I could imagine folks who are literally living paycheck to paycheck, how they're feeling.
Well, if you look now, even at Walmart, we're seeing reports of triple-digit percentage price increases from rolls of tape to toys and more. And I think we all need to watch, even if Trump does tariffs, takes them away, retailers are starting to tell people, we're just going to raise prices no matter what, because we can pin the blame on the tariffs just like we pin the blame on COVID shortages. And the result is going to be gigantic price increases, big profits for corporations. But those people living to paycheck, they're going to be big in debt because of it.
And then those prices become sticky and it becomes harder.
That's right. It seems they never come down. We all still walk down the grocery store wondering, how on earth is this cereal $6.59? There's 100 cereals, 3 cereal companies. It's easier and easier for them to push up the prices.
But that also speaks to, on the price side, manufacturers and retailers, et cetera, they can jack their prices. The assumption is that the consumer is going to pay. And at a certain point in any given economy, this is a real thing, consumers decide, you know what, I'm not going to spend that money because my budget has gotten smaller now. It's tighter because there's less revenue coming in. The cost for the things that I've got to spend for has gone up. So consumers then make those choices where they impact the market too by their behavior. It's not just this is the impact of tariffs. It's not just what the retailers and the supply chain and all that is. It's on the other end of that how consumers then to say, you know what? We're just not taking that vacation. We're not going to go spend for this. We're not going to buy that. We're not going to get all these supplies that we would normally get at the beginning of the school year. That's the other impact. So when you start destabilizing the economy at both ends, that's the concern the Fed has had, and that's the line that they're trying to walk on tax, on interest rates, for example. But those other personal economies are big drivers, too.
Well, we're seeing that. There's signs that even upper income consumers, credit card delinquency is going up.
Yeah.
Auto loan delinquency is going up. FICO scores, those are our credit scores. First time in a while, they're going down. So we're already seeing the rubber band stretch for families. And who knows, this could make for many of them snap. And you know, some people, though, they cannot reduce their spending.
Right.
They need the diapers, they need the milk, they need to put food on the table, and they're the ones who are really going to get hit.
So you know all the work you spent the last few years doing is they're busy undoing it at the CFPB. They're also busy rolling back regulations from the post-financial crisis year. I'm going to read you something from Politico, and then you're going to explain it to me in English because it has to do with banking. Trump-appointed regulators are nearing completion of a proposal that would relax rules on how much of a capital cushion the nation's largest banks must have to absorb potential losses and remain solvent during periods of economic stress. What does that mean for the average person?
Well, for those who remember 2008, the banks actually got bailed out by the taxpayers. And the reason why is because their shareholders had such little skin in the game that when they had big losses, in order to protect the system, the government had to step in. So what we are seeing is another effort to roll back these regulations. And I think this is an invitation for more bailouts, just so bank executives and their shareholders can get richer. We saw this. The last Trump administration did this, and we had 3 major banks, Silicon Valley Bank, collapse over the course of a few days. And guess what? I had to vote for this, too. The government had to step in. I don't think Americans want large banks bailed out at a time when their health care is getting cut, when fundamental services are being destroyed, and they're just trying to get by.
Lights, camera, intel briefing. NBC News has exclusive new reporting that Tulsi Gabbard, the nation's highest-ranking intelligence official, is considering a major overhaul of President Trump's daily briefing to make it more like his preferred way of consuming information. And that includes creating a version that looks like a Fox News show. NBC's Courtney Kube has that exclusive new reporting. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling is back. Courtney, I think in his second term, Trump has gotten these daily briefings far less often than his predecessors, but even less than during his first term. What more can you tell us about all this?
Yeah, that's right, Chris. So we looked back at his public schedule, and in the first several months of his presidency, that is from his inauguration until the end of May, which of course was last week, President Trump received, according to his public schedule, 14 presidential daily briefings. Now, for perspective, during his first term in office, only several years ago, he received 55 briefings in that same period of time. And according to some of his other predecessors, including President Joe Biden, received 90 in that same period of time. Now, officials we spoke with said that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, is very aware of the fact that President Trump simply is not taking the PDB as often as he did in the past and his predecessors have. As part of that and as part of her job, she is trying to look at ways to recast the PDB, essentially to make the president want to take it more, to make it more of a form that the way that he likes to consume information. Presidents, according to the officials we spoke with, have taken it differently in every different term. For instance, President Obama liked to read his PDB while he was on the treadmill. President George W. Bush liked to read it in front of some of his officials so he could ask questions in real time. As part of these discussions, Tulsi Gabbard has reached out to current and former officials. One of the ideas that has come up, Chris, has been to make it into essentially a newscast, to make it look more like the sort of information that the president likes to consume, that is Fox News. Now, at this point, there is no decision made to actually do that, but that is one of the discussion or one of the ideas that is under discussion, Chris.
General, I wonder what you make of the lack of frequency, apparently, of what this president does in terms of getting his presidential daily brief and why it's so important. I mean, we hear about the presidential daily brief, but a lot of people may not know why it's given such a high priority by most presidents.
Well, most of government is based on intelligence and information flow, Chris. And it's interesting to me. I find this, a potential for an Intel and Friends kind of broadcast to be very fascinating. And as Courtney said, the intelligence officials do guide their briefings based on what their principal wants to have and how they want to do it. But this is really kind of, I hate to use this expression, but dumbing it down quite a bit. When I was a commander, as all senior leaders in the military and in government get, I used to get a black book every morning, and it used to really set my pace for the day to see what was going on in my relatively small area of operation, which was Europe. What you're talking about now is giving the president an intelligence briefing, not only on a global environment, but also that affect all of his different cabinet officials, like healthcare or treasury or commerce or in military. So you're talking about something that comes into the president that certainly has to be compact in its nature, but it can't be simplistic. And I think that's what Tulsi Gabbard is attempting to provide to keep his attention for a short period of time. And it doesn't go with the back and forth that you normally see when you get intelligence briefings in government positions, because when you read something, you always have questions. If it's presented like a Fox News broadcast, I would be concerned that it wouldn't quite have the same kind of impact that you would see when you're talking to a bunch of intelligence professionals who are trying to give you the latest data so you can make decisions as the leader of the free world.